welcome to the Kink Perspective. My name is Chris. I'm a psychotherapist and consultant. This past week, I got a chance to talk about what happens when a dynamic ends. When we come to the end of it, and what do we do if there's a bad breakup? What do we do if we walk away? The coping strategies when it's an extremely deep dynamic? And as I started to touch base about that, and this kind of discussion was spurred by a couple of people. These were something that we didn't, it's a realization that we really don't address this. How do we uncondition ourselves emotionally, psychologically, even physically after a dynamic ends? But there's also another side to this as well. We need to, when I touched base on that earlier in the week, I didn't get a chance to talk about the other part that's really quite important. And the other part of that coin is what happens if we have a partner who dies, if we're in a long-term dynamic, we get married or in a poly setting or whatever the case may be, and we are with this person for decades, and we have now become so conditioned by everything that their death is going to have a sudden impact. Or, I was reading in the news lately, obviously, with someone like Bruce Willis, who has prefrontal dementia. I know it's more to it than that, but it's a terminal illness, somewhere between 5 and 8 years left in his life. And for somebody who's only 67 years old, it's a good life expectancy. He's probably had a full life, but obviously it's going to deteriorate over time. And his care, his loved ones, and they're trying to make the most of it now. So on today's episode, I kind of really want to focus on these couple of aspects and the emotional play this is going to have towards us, and how do we deal? How do we broach these? How does one person or another navigate their loved ones or their dominants or their submissives or whatever they are in the community, terminal illness? I want to kind of start there. And more specifically, what qualities are needed in a partner when their loved one is diagnosed? Are they going to be there? Are we talking about compassionate? Are they going to be scared and run and leave? Although people tend to be well-intentioned, the problem is when we start looking at these questions, when we ask them, they're not all-encompassing, and they usually don't cover everything we need to cover, and so we have to deep dive into it. The reality is that the focus on an individual partner proves inadequate, and especially when we're addressing the complexity of the crucial question is, how does not just the person we're going to start with illness today, that's been diagnosed with a terminal illness, or it's not just their responsibility, but the person who's finding out that their partner has it. The real question is, how does the couple handle it? How do the two people face and address this issue? And it's a very fundamentally strong question. Terminal illness not only affects the person that has it, right? And the worst part about that, it draws a line in the sand. We know where it begins at the point of diagnosis for us, and we know roughly when we're going to have a line in the sand. And this depends on the terminal illness, the time frame, and its aggressiveness, right? We have to understand that our bonds to our partner are far deeper than we tend to understand. Our conscious reality doesn't always take into account everything at that moment, up until that moment when we find out, oh gosh, something is going on, our partner is sick. What is our life going to look like without them? Obviously, we are going to rally around our partners and take care of their needs and everything else, but we also have to look at the other side, that we have to address that if, let's say, this is a dominant or a submissive, it really doesn't matter who's getting sick. Not only is obviously our primary focus on taking care of them, but protocols need to then start being put in place to take care of ourselves. If a dominant has been in a 10, 15, or 20-year dynamic, for that bond to stop, for all of the ritual activities, from the daily tasks, from the management, that becomes a quick and immediate shutdown when that all stops. And then the same goes, this is going to go for either partner in either direction. So I'm just going to speak more fluidly when I talk that way, right? We need to understand that our partners' lives, and how they affect us, how they impact our relationship, and the boundaries that we've created together, they're still going to exist, right? Especially emotionally after the our partner is gone. And we have to learn then the coping strategies to shift that mindset from potentially servitude or dominance into care. I'm not assuming or saying that people won't do that, but this becomes a major dynamic shift. Earlier last year, very start of my podcast, and I've written about it before. I wrote about what I called, it was a 27-year love story, and it was a dynamic, and it was very much covering kind of this topic. And I discussed, it was a client of mine that's still going through grief and is now proceeding forward through the process of healing, who's submissive, his wife, partner of, gosh, I don't know, 30, 40 years. I can't really recall at the top of my head right now. But they had a long history. And when she got sick, his whole care was about his whole focus, and everybody's gonna say, "Oh, well, it should be," or "That's really sweet," and it's kind, and it is. And he shifted from the dominance model of, and it's not quite the subservient model, but he did. He became the caregiver, looked after her. He did some wonderful things where to ease her final days, as her mind began to drift. He traveled state lines in the height of the COVID pandemic to get her, I think it was a pie, and bring it back to her so she could have this, final memories, these final tastes, even though that she couldn't, she was struggling with him, and as everything was breaking down. But the reality is, amongst all of that care, and amongst all, he didn't take care of himself. We tend to neglect ourselves when we're taking care of our partners. Our sleep lacks. We're not eating healthily, so our nutrition drops, right? Our physicality stops. And all of these things are still important. And I'm not saying, well, you need to run out to the gym while your partner's laying in bed because they've got, they're ill, and go spend 6 hours pumping iron. I'm not saying that. But I am saying it is quite important to look after ourselves as much as we are looking after our partners, our great loves, right? Because if we don't, and I've said this not here, I have a client that was going through a really rough time, has children, and really kind of a messy divorce. And I could see, being run down. And I said, you have to look after yourself, because if you don't look after yourself, if you don't find some time for yourself during the week to recharge, doing all these things for your children, you're eventually going to run out of steam. Then you're going to get sick, and then you can't do anything for your children. And then where are you at? So in this same sense, we have to look at it through this lens. So how do we proceed when we're starting to move forward and we've discovered, and I'm going to cover the death part here in the second half of this. But how do we proceed forward once we found out our partners have told us they have a debilitating physical illness, so their time is going to be cut short? The psychological impact, the initial shock of that, that's going to be taken on by the couple, that's just the beginning. The trials of being the partner for the loved one, so the person that doesn't have the terminal illness, are just as severe and wrenching as I've stated before. It's going to leave in no part any part of your life. Every part of your life is going to be touched by this. And it's going to be quite consuming, which is what I was talking about before, right? The problem is this isn't overly studied. There's not a whole lot of research that goes into all of this because, it's hard to get people who are grieving to want to spend their time doing a study. So It's really difficult to navigate this journey, especially the ones that you're going to go on. So we don't have a lot of ways. I mean, we can understand grief when people have been grieving, and we can help them get through those parts. But there's no real manual to refer to here. And sadly, that puts a lot of people on their own. And I'm not trying to say that there's not complete, there's no guidance for this, but there is no real self-help guidance for this. There's people who've talked about their own experience, and most of the time they're selling their books for $39.95, and that's not really helpful because all it's doing is covering what they did, and it doesn't you normally reflect back. So we have to understand, if this becomes the case where our partner is sick, they're terminally ill, that we'll speak that this is happening to a dominant. A submissive here is literally going to be looking at a paradigm shift in who they are. That subservience can be there on some level. They might go and, like I said before, caregiver or their party, but you're going to be really now, you're phasing and toning down your protocols, your rituals, probably your task orientations, requesting what the new tasks are going to be, because that's no longer going to be the focus. It can't be the focus, right? You might keep them up for a little while, but as the party gets more ill or loses their physical health decreases, these things are going to become increasingly more difficult. You have to be willing to turn to family, to friends, to your community for help, to lean on, because again, you are going to need that strength. And it is very difficult. This isn't something, a lot of us encounter, let alone there's not a lot of us that talk about this. We have to get used to, those good night phone calls or good night texts. Those aren't going to be happening anymore. We might want to start opening up this conversations with other submissives that we know, or other self-help groups that are out there to help us deal with the difficulty in coping with loss, and the suddenly finding ourselves all alone, because it's different. It's difficult. Sorry. It's very difficult to go from a life that we think, where we have all this time, and it's going to be taken from us. And you have to allow yourselves the chance to grieve, to plan, right? To create that plan together while that person is still, I'm not talking most debilitating diseases. Quite a few of them are the more common ones. They typically, it's a year or 5 years, and that's their max. There are some, obviously, with like very aggressive cancers that 3 months, 6 months, a month. Yes, I do realize that. But even if that happens, one of the things is, once you work through that initial shock, you too have to create a plan. And because this topic has come up, I think this is a great time now that, yeah, this is a morbid conversation, but the reality is, in life, we have to be willing to address it. We have to be willing to say, hey, we're in this dynamic now. We've put in, we've got 6 months, great, we're clicking along. In the next 6 months, we're talking about moving in together within a year. After a year, maybe marriage is a consideration in our dynamic, or a formal collaring ceremony. So that's great. You're really putting a lot of thought into it. When you get that year in, you're clicking on 2 years, 3 years. This needs to be a conversation that starts coming out. I'm not saying that we can negate, we need to negate this conversation right off the bat. But I think this is something, when you're in a dynamic that's definitely starting to go the distance, where the relationship is grown, the foundations are built, you are enthusiastically trying out or seeking to push each other's limitations. You're living life to its fullest, and that you both have agreed, this is the person I want to spend it with, regardless of whatever form that takes on, if it's marriage or some formal other agreement. This then needs to really be brought to the forefront, because if we're not going to talk about what happens, there is no guarantees in this world. We could go step outside of our house, somebody gets into a car accident, we get hit, meteor falls out of the sky. Unfortunately, these things do happen every day. We are not invincible, and these are real conversations to have. And we're not having the conversation, and that's the other part of this. We're not having this conversation because we're trying to be morbid. I would actually argue to have this type of conversation, we're doing this out of care and love because we're concerned for our partners. We know that we've become happily dependent. I'm not talking dependent style relationships. We depend on each other. We care for each other. We love each other. We want to take care of and nurture and grow with our partners. But if we can't plan for the unexpected, I've always talked about in the negotiations part, there are three things that I abide by. And the first one is always non-negotiables. And I always cover what those are, life or education or family and so on and so forth. I will never negotiate those things. That goes for the person I'm with. They don't negotiate those things. Those take precedence over our dynamic. And then you have the negotiables, which then cover the things in our relationship, when we play, how often we play, what we're going to do. And these aren't the same as limitations. And then finally, I cover the X factor. And as I mentioned before, in the X factor, death does kind of pop up there. And I remember mentioning it. I think I mentioned it more as an afterthought, not really being serious, but, you start getting older and these things start becoming a reality. And so I think if you're going to get to the point in your relationship or in your dynamic where you're doing your, maybe monthly or quarterly, quarter yearly check-ins where you're renegotiating and figuring out what you want for the future, if you probably are hitting that 1 year mark or 6 month mark, depending on how strongly you feel towards one another, I think this is a good conversation to have. There's nothing wrong with having this conversation. There's nothing scary about having this conversation. And so what do we do? Especially if you're going to be more invested in the heavier types of protocols and rituals, like if you come home and your submissive is there serving you and they're always waiting and they're either nude or kneeling or they're doing a backflip when you walk through the door and then you've negotiated that in, right? Or every night after dinner, there's always an after dinner spanking. Whatever. We're setting up all of these rituals. We're doing all of these behavior modifications. We are doing all these emotionally behavioral things that are changing somebody, right? We are agreeing to do this. But as we alter somebody's behavior in general, regardless of what that is, physically, emotionally, or mentally, we need to also be adult enough to have the conversation of what if. You don't have to dwell on it. You don't have to spend hours talking about it. But the reality is these things happen. So, you can't be afraid to have these conversations. And coping mechanisms. So like I talked about earlier this week, I talked about the stages of grief, and that's going to be one thing. Reaching out to your family and friends when your partner passes away. Reaching out to the community. Seeing a therapist. Getting involved in mental well-being exercises. Mindfulness. Taking up something that's going to help you change your time. Learning to move forward. These are all become important steps. Right? You can maintain some of the rituals as you've moved forward. You could even transfer some of those rituals into like a memorial type service at your funeral. Maybe that becomes the point for you. You're breaking free. You have to accept your emotions. It's not easy. You have to accept what you feel, allow yourself to feel those things, and then work through those feelings. You don't want to stop yourself or tell yourself, don't cry. If you feel sad and you feel that you're going to start crying, you have to allow your emotions to flow. Most importantly is you got to start talking about things. You have to be vocal. People think that, I always tell people, especially if, I have a lot of single clients, if you're troubled, if your emotions are bothering you, right, and you've got no one to talk to, then talk out loud. It doesn't matter if that sounds strange, but you're vocalizing how you feel. You're not internalizing it where you're just sitting there thinking on it, you're ruminating about it, you're dwelling about it, and it actually makes the situation worse. When your partner passes away, you can preserve their memories. You can honor their memories. You can honor that. You can take your favorite flogger and maybe put it away and know that that's not going to be. But don't put a limit on yourself or a rule on yourself that says, well, I'll never be flogged again. Because you don't then at that point know what will happen in the future. But probably the most important tip I can give you in this conversation is that you really need to make sure that you have a support system in place. That it's highly important to deal and express yourself, whether you go to a group support, local churches have them, local, schools after hours, kind of like AA type things, but, they're for dealing with grief. Speaking with someone like myself, a therapist, about coping with grief, coping with loss, dealing with memories, dealing with your emotions. All of these things are important. Reaching out to your family in a time of grief. When you are sad, especially if you haven't moved out of a place you're sharing or you haven't decided what to do, is by creating new memories. And when memories are becoming overwhelming or depression starts setting on, one thing that I always tell clients is you need to step outside of your home. Go for a walk. Go down the street. Tell yourself, I'm going to go right, then I'm going to go left, then I'm going to go left, then I'm going to go right. However you do it, it's not about the journey. It's just about the time that you're gone. Because at least that way, and people will tell me, oh, well, you're talking about avoidance. We're not talking about avoidance. We are talking about a coping mechanism so you're not dwelling in the thoughts or your feelings that are weighing heavily upon you or weighing you down by sitting in your home, because that's not productive. You have to maybe consider, at some point, potentially moving from where you are. Or if you love your home and you can work through your emotions there, you can create your little preserved memories area. And you can celebrate that person's life. That project you always wanted to start or get to by building your garden, this is a great way to channel some of that energy that you're going to have stored. There is no real good way. After I read Luna's post, there is no real one answer to all of this. These are great suggestions on what to do and how we deal with some of these things. There is behavior modifications get a little bit more tricky because when we have altered and given up control, so for example, orgasm control, and where we have been trained or we have trained a submissive to orgasm on command, you are going to have to go through and consider going through a deprogramming kind of cause that will help you regain control of your own bodily autonomy again. There are deprogramming programs out there that allow us to regain that autonomy. And it's not because, somebody's been completely manipulated. It's just a way for it to help you. Again, there is a lot to this discussion. I'm dancing on some things. I can't go too deep into others. Because I'm not here to offer free therapy. That's not how this works. But you have to be willing to understand there are going to be a plethora of things you are going to encounter, whether you are the person who is ill, who is dying, or the person who's the carer or is suddenly widowed or left alone because your partner has died suddenly. Coping with grief, coping with loss, they're not easy, right? And the closer you are to somebody, the more intense your grief is going to be. And it's natural to feel that way, right? You need to understand that when we're going through this process, this is one of the biggest life challenges you're going to go through. And I'm not talking about like life expenditures, personal challenges. I know that, like, I had a friend when I was much younger who was very much like a brother to me, and when he passed, I was devastated. Didn't know how to deal with it. I had a really strong support group and network of friends. I grieved with his family, and Rob, this person touched my life when he passed away, and I cared for him. I mean, he was meant so much to me, and and I didn't understand then when I was young how to cope with that, because then out of my loss was a lot of anger, a lot of not understanding. I shut people out. I didn't allow anybody to get close. I lost some friendships because of it. And I'm mentioning this because we don't want to make that same mistake. I don't want to see anybody else make that mistake, because yes, it's important we take our time, but again, this goes back to we have to look after ourselves. And it's difficult. When we lose somebody we love, and it doesn't matter, I'm more focused on the topic of losing a partner or a spouse, a significant other. But with such a significant loss, life may never seem quite the same way again. You might feel that your spark, your step is a little out of sync. But time, working through it, confronting your emotions, working that support group, eases that sorrow, eases that burden. We're able then, with that ability, to start to look to the future and eventually come to terms with our loss. It doesn't necessarily mean you'll decide to date again or you won't date again. You approach all of these stages in times when you're ready, right? So I want to kind of wrap this whole thing up with, I want to cover a couple of the things, because I got a really nice email. Some people had asked me, I've heard this about grieving, or I've heard this about grief. Can you talk about that? Absolutely. One question was that I received is, Chris, if I just ignore what's happening, will that make this go away faster? Unfortunately, no. The more you ignore your pain, the more you keep from addressing it, the more intense and the worse it's going to get in the long run. For true emotional healing to start taking place, you have to confront and face this grief, and you have to actively deal with it. Now, nobody's telling you when you have to deal with it, but the reality is at some point, you're going to have to face it and deal with it, right? Another question I've gotten is, oh, well, I didn't really cry when they passed away. I get really uncomfortable during funerals, and I kind of laugh. But somebody told me that because I didn't cry, I really didn't care. Absolutely, totally ridiculous. Crying, yes, is one emotional response to death or sadness or being upset, but it's not the only response. Anger is a response. Laughter is a response, because can be a nervous reaction. Those who don't cry, they may not feel the pain as deeply as somebody other, or they don't necessarily know how to show it in the same way, right? My favorite question that I get all the time is, "Oh, there's just a period. I shouldn't grieve more than a few weeks or a couple months or even a year." That's ridiculous. When you are grieving, right? This isn't 16th century feudal Japan. You don't have a new lord, and somebody's telling you you've got 1 year, and then your grieving is over, and you're going to go and marry somebody else. That's not how this works. There's no specific time frame in which you are going to go through the grief process, or how long that process is going to take you. That literally depends from person to person, right? Another fun one is always, oh, shouldn't I just, put on a brave face even though they're gone? Well, I counter with that is, it's okay to feel upset. It's okay to feel scared, feel alone. These are all normal emotional responses to the death of someone you cared for. None of these responses make you appear weak. and you're not protecting anyone, your family, your friends, your close relatives, whatever, your in-laws, by pretending to be something you're not. I would argue that showing who you truly are and expressing yourself emotionally not only will benefit you in the long run, but it benefits them, because then they know that you are all kind of grieving at a level, and you can lean on each other. Another kind of question that came up was, oh yeah, so you're talking about building memories and remembering who they are, but doesn't that mean if I move forward, I'm just forgetting about the person who I was with? No, that's absolutely no, it doesn't. Moving, just because you decide to move forward and on with your life, all it is indicating is you're starting to accept the loss that has happened to you, that emotional pain that's going on. That doesn't equate to meaning you forgot what happened or how important that person was to you. You can learn to move forward with your life and keep the memory of someone that you loved and cared for alive, right? And keep that inside of you. But you can't be expected to shut down completely and become this feudal shell of yourself that is, reduced to a 4-year-old child having a temper tantrum. It's not like that. And the reality is that as we move forward through life, the memories that we hold on to become more and more integral into defining the people we are because of the impact of the person who is with us. And that's how we honor that memory. That's how we honor that relationship. I know this is a heavy subject, and I haven't kind of touched base on something like this before. Um, Full disclosure, I'm not a big fan of talking about death. I don't mind helping others through a grieving process, but if somebody asks me personally, I tend not to. I'm a realist. I understand it's going to happen, and so like that's my acknowledgement. But we all acknowledge things differently. I want you to understand. I talked about this again, and so this is worth repeating, regardless. So in these two instances, your stages of grief. At some point, you're going to be angry. Um, you're going to want to bargain. You're going to try to deny it's happening. You're going to get depressed it's happening. And when you're ready, someday you're going to accept that it's happened. Right? These are the 5 stages of grief. These are the 5 stages of grief. This is the Kubler-Ross model. All of these things that we're going to face as we get older, because none of us are getting younger. These are real conversations to start having. I really do, again, want to thank Luna Lux for writing an exquisite, such a brilliantly written essay on this. Luna is on FetLife. If you are on there, take a look. I've seen some similar writings by people on fetish.com and on a couple of other social medias, Facebook, and so on and so forth. But look into loss. Even if loss hasn't occurred, there's nothing wrong with talking about death. Being prepared for everything, or understanding when we talk, we all kind of talk about rack and, SSC, and we throw all these terminologies, and we're trying to say that we're prepared. But since I've spurred this discussion, I always ask, are you prepared for death? Does any of your conversations cover terminal illness? If an accident occurs and suddenly somebody dies? And you'd think I kind of sucked the air out of the room, but the reality is we have to have these conversations. They're difficult. I'm not saying you need to go into your dynamic that you just started with somebody after a week and start talking about this. But this puts us on the radar now for future negotiations when you are maybe 6 months or maybe you're a year into your relationship. It is something to really, truly consider. Right? And it also allows you to start discovering if somebody doesn't want to talk about death, at least why. You're finding out why. But if they're shutting you down, or they don't, that the discussion is a no-go zone, and you're planning your future. I mean, let's be real. When we all clock into our 40s, and at some point, all of us are, I'm clocking towards my 50s. These are real conversations. I don't like to think about these, but these are real conversations we have to have. And as we get older, planning is real. When you have children, these conversations are literally happening at people who are 25 years old. They're like, we got to write a will and set up trusts, because they're being anything, the one word I haven't mentioned, having this discussion is being a responsible adult. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's respectful. It covers all the things we discuss and love about the lifestyle. I know this was emotionally heavy. It's not like me to really get into something like this, and I promise next week it'll be something a little bit more light and upbeat. I am working on some new interviews. There was somebody I'm speaking to about needle play. I'm going to try to get to some more interviews. Do hope you liked this episode. I know this was a little bit, again, on the rougher side, but it's got to be addressed. It's got to be talked about, right? That's part of my job. We don't run away from our emotions. We confront them and deal with them and work through them. I'd like to, again, hear back from the community, your thoughts, your feelings on this. Please don't be afraid to talk about it. I think it's truly important. This brings a bigger understanding to the community, and it helps others when we talk about these things, how we've handled it, or how we've approached these conversations, or if death has occurred, how we dealt with that death of our partner. Sharing these stories helps you grow, and it helps our community grow. And honestly, that's why I do this, is to help us all grow and learn and enjoy our community together. So, with that said, until next time, everybody, be safe and stay tuned.